The usual media narrative sticks to a few basics. Tariffs protect domestic jobs, respond to unfair trade practices, or serve as a geopolitical weapon. All true to a point, but these are surface level answers. They don't really explain why tariffs are so emotionally powerful or why they reappear across completely different political systems and ideologies. Something deeper is going on, and it has more to do with identity, fear, and control than with the textbook definition of trade imbalances. Let's start with something rarely discussed. Tariffs are not just economic tools, they are cultural symbols. For example, when a country imposes a tariff on foreign steel or cars or rice, it's not just tweaking the cost of imports, it's telling its people, we make stuff, we matter. We are not just passive consumers in a global mall. That symbolism lands hard, especially in countries that feel like their manufacturing base is eroding, their cultural confidence is shaky, or their political center is fragile. Tariffs become a form of economic nationalism, but more than that, a ritual of self assertion. In the United States, for decades, mainstream politicians treated tariffs as economic poison, something only protectionists or fringe candidates would propose. But the rise of Trump shows how tariffs have moved from taboo to normalized. The media often frames this as a response to China's trade practices or a bid to revive the Rust Belt. But step back a little, and it's something more primal. In a globalized economy where people often feel powerless, tariffs are a lever you can actually pull. You can't stop automation. You can't control the flow of capital to Malaysia or Mexico. But you can slap a 25% duty on Chinese solar panels and feel like you are doing something. Now look at India. In the name of self reliance, the Modi government has been raising tariffs on a range of goods from toys to electronics. It's not about autarky. India still wants to trade, but there is a growing political calculus that sees tariffs as part of a civilization rebirth. That's a phrase you won't hear in Bloomberg or CNBC, but it's essential. When tariffs get deployed not just to protect an industry, but to revive a vision of national strength, they enter sacred territory. You can't debate them with spreadsheets anymore. There's also a psychological dimension to tariffs that's hardly ever discussed. Tariffs appeal to our instinctive sense of fairness. If someone is cheating by subsidizing their exports or exploiting weak labor laws, we feel justified in retaliating. But here is the twist: this sense of fairness is often asymmetrical and emotionally charged. Countries apply tariffs not just where there is a proven abuse, but where there is fear of being outcompeted, fear of losing relevance, fear that your country is becoming a warehouse for other people's ambitions. And sometimes that fear is economic, but sometimes it's about power. During the Cold War, trade was weaponized as part of the broader ideological battle. But in the 21st century, trade itself has become the ideology. If you are not winning on trade, it feels like you are not winning, period. That's why the logic of tariffs is rarely just about jobs. It's about sovereignty. Tariffs are a way of saying we decide what enters our borders and on what terms. It's a control theater, but theater that matters deeply to people who feel like globalization has reduced their nation to a logo on a shipping container. There's also something fascinating happening around digital trade that almost no one talks about. Most people think tariffs are about physical goods, steel, pork, textiles, but the next frontier is data. Yes, data. Some countries are beginning to argue that cross border data flows should be treated like trade in any other good. That means the possibility of data tariffs, charges, or restrictions on how much data a foreign company can extract, store, or monetize from users within a country. Media barely touches this because it doesn't fit the old mold. But make no mistake, data protectionism is the tariff of the 21st century, and it's only just beginning. Even stranger is how tariffs have begun to fuse with climate policy. Take the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism. It's essentially a tariff on imports that don't meet European environmental standards. On the surface, it's about fighting climate change. But look a little deeper, and it's all about preventing European competitiveness. Why should local firms spend more to go green while Chinese or Turkish firms get a pass? The answer for Brussels is tariffs. But unlike traditional ones, these are morally coded. They come wrapped in the language of sustainability, and that makes them harder to challenge, even as they provoke trade tensions in disguise. Tariffs also highlight something rarely discussed in polite company. The world doesn't trust globalization anymore. Not really. Not after COVID. Not after 2008 crash. Not after supply chains broke down and people realized how little their countries actually made. Tariffs are symptoms of a larger retreat, not just from economic openness, but from the very idea that interdependence is always good. The media sometimes paints this as an irrational populism, but maybe it's a rational realism. Maybe people have woken up to the vulnerabilities hidden in these cheap TVs and next day deliveries. There's a final thread here worth pulling. Tariffs have an emotional logic, and emotions don't fade when economists disapprove. They persist, they evolve, and they connect with the identity in a way few other economic tools do. You will hear endless debate about efficiency and productivity comparative advantage. But you won't hear many people admit that tariffs are about status, about pride, about being seen as more than just a cheap labor pool or a captive market. In fact, the very idea of comparative advantage is increasingly being questioned, though you won't hear it often outside academic papers. What if comparative advantage isn't static? What if it's shaped by power, policy, even historical coercion? If a country was colonized and its industries destroyed, is it still efficient to stay in agriculture? Or is that a trap disguised as logic? Tariffs, for all their cost, can be a way to challenge that framing. To say, we're not just going to accept what the world says we are good at, we are going to decide that for ourselves. It's risky. Tariffs can backfire. They can lead to trade wars, higher prices, even inflation. But sometimes countries are willing to take those hits for the sake of something bigger, a sense of self determination, a reassertion of dignity. And that's what missing in most mainstream coverage. It's not that countries don't know the cost, it is that they're willing to pay them. So, if you are watching the global resurgence of tariffs and wondering why the world seems to be going backward, ask yourself, what if it's not backward at all? What if it's forward in a different direction, toward a world where control matters more than convenience and pride matters more than price? Start with a seemingly strange question. Who benefits when two countries go to war economically, not militarily? Economically. Let's say the US imposes tariffs on Chinese solar panels. China retaliates by slapping tariffs on American soybeans. Obvious storyline, farmers and green energy sectors suffer. But beneath the noise, who steps in to fill the gap? Usually, it's a third party. When two big economies start hitting each other with tariffs, smaller or mid sized countries often see opportunity in the chaos. If the US doesn't want Chinese panels, maybe Vietnam's producers get a shot. If China won't buy American soybeans, maybe Argentina or Brazil gets a bigger slice. These are the geopolitical floaters of the global economy. Countries agile enough to navigate around trade wars and quietly benefit from the why. Take Malaysia, for instance. During the Trump era US China trade tensions, Malaysian tech exports to the US spiked. A lot of the components were the same ones previously shipped from China. It's not that Malaysia suddenly became more innovative, it is that global companies rerouted supply chains to sidestep tariffs. This happened so quickly and quietly that most media outlets missed it. But for Malaysia, it was a windfall. Then there are even more obscure winners, tiny tax havens and special economic zones. When tariffs go up, Some companies don't relocate factories, they relocate paperwork. Shell companies in a low tax jurisdictions like the Cayman Islands or Singapore reclassify goods to avoid tariffs. It's not always illegal, it's just a game of classification. For example, change a product's labeling slightly and suddenly qualifies as a component rather than a finished good, skirting higher duties. These micro maneuvers don't show up in economic theory, but they are real and very profitable for a select few. Now, let's talk about the silent losers, not the factories that will close. That's loud. The ones you don't hear about are in logistics, in ports, in the gray spaces of the global movement. When tariffs rise, it doesn't just slow trade, it reshapes the routes. Port workers in Singapore, longshoremen in Rotterdam, customs brokers in South Africa, they all feel the ripple effects. But these workers don't make compelling press conferences. They're buried in the system. So when a country imposes tariffs, it's not just retaliating, it's unknowingly undercutting some of its own invisible workforce. I note here one that's barely mentioned in mainstream trade coverage. Tariffs don't only alter trade flows, they change time. They think about it. With the tariffs, goods move slower. They pass through more hands, face more inspections, deal with more documentation. That lag affects everyone down the chain, especially small businesses that rely on just in time inventory. In a tariff heavy world, delay becomes a new kind of tax, not just on money, but on efficiency, trust, and predictability. There is also the question of how countries implement tariffs, and it's not always what it seems. Sometimes a tariff isn't even called a tariff. It's disguised as a technical regulation, as a safety inspection, as an environmental compliance fee. And if you think this is just a clever wording, think again. These disguised tariffs, also known as non tariff barriers, are exploding globally. Japan, for instance, has long used arcane food safety rules to slow down beef imports. The EU has complex labeling laws that act as a de facto barriers to foreign wine, cheese, and even honey. What's fascinating here is that these non tariff barriers are politically safer. You can raise them quietly. They don't grab headlines like slapping a 25% duty on foreign goods, but they often achieve the same result, keeping imports out or making them more expensive without triggering WTO alarms. That's why many countries now operate in this gray zone. It's a tariff protection without bad press. Now, let's take a detour into digital surveillance. Yes, that connects to tariffs. Bear with me. In the age of trade tensions, countries are not just taxing goods, they are tracking their journey with obsessive detail. Custom agencies in the US, China, and India are now using AI and blockchain to trace the origin of goods down to the subcomponent. Why? Because with complex supply chains, companies can game the system. A car might be assembled in Mexico, but its engine is from Germany and the sensors are from China. Which part gets tariffed? That question now demands forensic economic tracing, and it's creating a quiet revolution in customs enforcement. Speaking of people, let's talk migration, a subject rarely connected to tariffs but absolutely central. High tariffs, especially on food and essentials, can create pressure points in low income countries. When a country imposes tariffs on agricultural machinery or fertilizers, the impact on local farmers can be devastating. Yields drop, food prices rise, and migration patterns shift. People don't leave because of war or climate alone. Sometimes they leave because tariffs made farming impossible. This indirect effect of tariffs on population movement is almost never discussed, but it's real and it's measurable. In West Africa, for instance, when certain agricultural inputs were made more expensive due to regional trade barriers, subsistence farmers began abandoning the land, not because they wanted to, but because the economics stopped working. Migration becomes a tariff echo, a slow, silent consequence. Another piece often missed, the psychological toll tariffs can take on business owners, especially in emerging markets. In developed economies, a tariff might reduce quarterly earnings. In developing countries, it might ruin a family. A single tariff decision in Brussels or Washington can send a ripple through Moroccan textile factory or a Bangladeshi ceramics exporter. These are not giant corporations with buffers. They are often family run operations deeply integrated into their communities, and they operate on razor thin margins. A 5% increase in cost can mean the difference between survival and collapse. The psychological toll goes deeper. It's not just about money, it's about visibility. Global supply chains have long treated small producers as invisible cogs. When tariffs go up and importers start shifting orders, these producers don't just lose revenue, they lose relevance, their sense of agency, their place in the world economy. That's something numbers can't capture, but stories can. And yet, those stories are rarely told. Then there is the future of automation, which tariffs are subtly accelerating. Here is how. When you raise tariffs on imported goods, you make local production more attractive, but also more expensive due to labor. So, what happens? Companies don't always hire more workers. They automate. That's right. Tariffs can actually speed up job loss in manufacturing by incentivizing firms to invest in robots, not people. This is the paradox nobody wants to talk about. Protecting jobs via tariffs may end up pushing these jobs into machines. It's playing out quite nicely in places like Germany and South Korea, where high tech industries use trade barriers not just to compete, but to buy time for transition. The goal isn't to preserve labor, it is to prepare for a post labor economy. Tariffs, in that sense, are not old fashioned, they are scaffolding for a new industrial era. And that's something the mainstream media rarely explores because it complicates the whole jobs versus trade debate. Let's add one more layer: insurance. Trade finance and insurance markets are directly impacted by tariffs in obscure but profound ways. When tariffs rise, the risk premium on cross border contracts increases. That means businesses pay more to insure the same shipment, and that cost is passed down not just to consumers, but to smaller firms that can't afford high premiums. So, in essence, tariffs tax not only trade, but trust. They raise the cost of belief that your goods will arrive unchallenged across borders. Finally, let's talk about memory, historical memory. Many of the countries imposing or suffering from tariffs today have deep scars from the colonial era trade systems. Systems that extracted resources, killed local industries, and dictated terms under the guise of free trade. For these countries, tariffs aren't just policy, they are resistance. They are a form of intergenerational economic justice. They may not always be efficient, but a kind of post colonial tax on forgotten. In the next episode, we'll step into that fight and see how tariffs are rewriting global power. See you there.